Afternoon, everyone. My name is John Gutierrez. I'm the chair of the Latin American and Latinx Studies Department here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. I'm delighted to welcome you. I apologize for the late start. We had some technical issues on our end, but we want to jump right into this conversation with Mike Madrid to help us understand a little bit about the changes and the growth of the Latino electorate in the United States. So, Mike Madrid is a nationally recognized political consultant with more than 3 decades of experience leading campaigns, a pioneer in Latino communications and outreach strategies for state, local, and national political races. Mike is one of the few consultants who has successfully worked for major campaigns on both sides of the aisle. In 2020, Mike rather famously co-founded the Lincoln Project, a Republican anti-Trump organization. Currently, he is a senior fellow at UC Irvine's School of Social Ecology. His most recent book, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy, which I happen to have here, was published by Simon and Schuster this past June. And it received a recent review from the Washington Post calling it, quote, a handbook for how Democrats and Republicans might convince Latinos that they belong in their respective tents. Mike, it's nice to welcome you to John Jay. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a real honor to be with you. Thank you so much, John. I was hoping we could be in person, but I'm sure we'll be doing that together soon at some point.
I hope so. I hope so. I want to welcome you here to New York in person for sure. So I want to get started since we got a late start. I, you know, I, I've been thinking about your book as part of kind of a broader conversation that I think is happening in the country. There seems to be this moment where a lot of people are trying to explain the Latino community, right? We have Maria Arana, who we've hosted here on campus, has a book on the Latino community. There is Jerry Cadava's work on the Hispanic Republicans. Luis Miranda's Relentless. Paula Ramos has a new book on Latinos and the right wing. You're part of this moment, and I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about why you think this is happening. Why is it that publishers are so eager to tell this story?
That's a great question, and I think the first answer is simply our numbers, how fast our community is growing, and we'll get to the concept of community in just a second. But just through sheer numbers, Latinos, there will be more Latino voters in every single swing state and will be larger than the margin of victory in every one of them. The other is, we just surpassed Black voters in 2020 as the country's largest minority. 38% of our voters are under the age of 30. 20% of our voters will be voting for the first time in November. So we're really at the crest of this enormous tsunami, this huge tidal wave of demographic change that's going to transform the country. In the next 15 years, America will become a non-white majority country, largely because of this Latinization of America. And we don't have, as a country, we don't have a vernacular for it beyond Black and white, beyond the African-American white construct.
Right.
So it's not just that the math is so big and overwhelming, it's our very institutional capacity to understand what this means is being challenged. And we're seeing this playing out politically and in the workforce. And it's a struggle. And I think that's why there is such a good body of work from great minds and great people. Worked with every one of the people you mentioned. We're all trying to get our arms around what's happening from very different perspectives. And I think if everybody's reading all of it, you're probably getting a good sense of some of the through lines and some of the distinctions.
Sure. I wanted to ask you something because you talked about the math, and early on in your book, you raise an issue that has been kind of gnawing at me for a bit. You write, as a political data guy, I often see the world in the black and white of data points, but there are other ways of seeing. I remember 20, 25 years ago how difficult it was to get good data, to find data that was accessible, right? That not just specialists were gonna find. That world has disappeared. We find you have much more access to data than ever before. And I'm wondering, alongside you, what does that data really tell us, right? I'm just curious to hear, as a self identified data guy, what is it that data can't see?
Well, let me say this, and as I also say too in politics when I work with candidates or clients, Latinos are both the easiest group to identify and the most difficult to identify. And that's part of the nature of kind of the duality of who we are and the fluidity of ethnicity amongst our people and in this country. It also speaks to that, and I hate that term, we're not a monolith, because no group is a monolith. No
Right,
group is a monolith. But we are seeing some very significant through lines. And the best way to describe Latinos at this moment in time, Professor, and that's an important qualifier. And I'll explain why in just a moment. But the most significant way to look at us as the emerging working class in this country.
mm,
Okay. If you had asked me this question 25 years ago, I would say we are the largest immigrant group coming to this country. And while that still may be the case, the explosion of growth in our community is overwhelmingly amongst the US born. And we're moving away from this stereotype of the immigrant and into the US born, English dominant, speaking, working class, upwardly mobile part of the American body politic and society. And that to me is the through line. It doesn't matter whether you're Puerto Riqueño, Mexicano, Cubano, whatever, although those distinctions do matter.
sure.
Overwhelmingly, what we are witnessing is the movement away from a racial and ethnic voting group, diaspora, into an economic class pocketbook voter. And that's what's transformed the Kamala Harris campaign entirely in the last 8 weeks. The messaging is completely different than you've seen Democrats talking to Latinos over the past 35, 40 years, completely entirely different.
Right.
And Republicans, of course, leaning into it in their own way. And that's created this new dynamic. And I think the book came out at just the perfect time because as I was articulating all of this, the Democrats and Kamala Harris really figured it out. And the way we're talking to non-white voters because of our community is really changing the approach of the two parties. And I think it's going to change all of our organizations and culture in the very, very near future.
Right. I'm glad that you raised this question of the working class issue because I think your book is actually one of the few books that raises this issue and places at the forefront of trying to understand the Latino community. That you really argue for moving past um, sort of an identity centered politics to recognizing the working class. And I should say this is an unusual argument to come from a Republican. So I just want to tell you I was kind of thrown for a loop a little bit. But you really
I'm
do
a very
place the
unusual Republican.
I can tell. Yes, absolutely. I think this placing of working class politics at the center of this sort of desire to understand the Latino community is really interesting, and I think in some ways may explain why it's so difficult for either one of the parties to make, sort of a definitive claim to owning the Latino electorate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let me say this. This is the data has been overwhelming for 3 decades that Latinos are a much more class-oriented voter than they are a racial or ethnic-oriented voter. Something happened in during the Obama administration. Kind of the zeitgeist of the era was the Obama coalition and demographics is destiny, right? All
Right,
all non-white people are born Democrats. Like 70% of us will vote Democrats forever in perpetuity, as long as you're not white. And
right,
this sort of fixation with this new emergent America led to this kind of false understanding, even though there was no evidence for that, by the way. There's never been any polling or research data that would suggest that's how Latino voters felt. But over 15, 16 years since then, what we've seen is an explosion again of this third and now a fourth generation of Latino voters who overwhelmingly identify, according to Pew Research, in their own words, as typical Americans. and they're either moving away from their Latinidad, or they are transforming Latinidad away from the stereotype of the recent migrant, the Spanish dominant speaker, and the issues that motivate that constituency. It's not to say they aren't extraordinarily foundational and important to who we are. That's our origin story. But at the same time, I think we have dramatically undervalued the sentiment on the community of where we are going. And that's the way people vote. They're voting on tomorrow, not on the past. And that's where I think the Democratic Party and the Democrats have been losing Latino voters for the better part of a decade now.
Right.
Unless anybody misunderstand, this book is not an argument for Republicanism. I criticize the Republican Party far more than
I know. Yeah.
right. Like I'm not a fan of either, having worked in both at very high levels. I both of them are getting it wrong for different reasons. And that's the opportunity for our community, by the way. We'll get to that later. But this is functionally and fundamentally and foundationally an economic class issue. And it's
Right.
becoming all the more clear as what we call the diploma divide continues to separate us as a country, where those with a college degree are more likely to become Democrats, and those without are equally as likely to become Republicans. And that's affecting our community because we are the largest segment of the non-college educated workforce that is now, dramatically filling up the employment roles and the registrars at, colleges and universities. Overwhelmingly women, by the way. I should say
Yeah.
overwhelmingly, but largely women.
No. Absolutely. Yeah.
Our women
Yeah.
are
You're
going to
seeing that
college at
here.
very,
Yeah.
very fast rates, much faster than our men. And that's created the largest gender gap in American politics amongst Latinos. Latinas are voting for Democrats at very high rates. Latino men is where you're seeing the rightward shift. And that gap is bigger between the genders than any other race or ethnic group.
Right. Let me, you mentioned origin stories, and we obviously have hopefully a number of students who are listening in. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your origin story. There was a part of it that struck me as very familiar. You don't necessarily talk a lot about the influence of the Chicano movement in California, and you're very clear that your parents sort of looked a little bit askance at Chicano activism. You instead, and I have to say this resonated with me because I think you and I are contemporaries from an age standpoint. You talk about the hostage crisis in Iran in 1979 and how you saw a particular vision of the country that even as a kid kind of um, struck you as not the America that you wanted to be a part of. It was an America that looked a little bit, it looked weak, right? Those images of hostages blindfolded and being paraded through Tehran, and you point to that moment as one of the reasons why you turned to Ronald Reagan and his vision of America. I remember that campaign. It was like you, it was the first campaign that I was aware of, right, as a kid. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what what it was that Reagan represented for you, that wanted to sort of drag you into the political process.
That's a great question. And, writing this book, Professor, there's a lot more vulnerability that I think I had to unpack a lot in order to kind of make a book that was going to be meaningful to people. Recognizing most of my readers of this book, hate Ronald Reagan, hate
Yeah,
Reagan,
yeah,
and really could never understand it. But what I wanted to do was to draw a parallel with my experience, my politicization, to some of what they are seeing with their primos or their tios or their brothers, and I'm saying men specifically, that are drawn towards a stronger figure and Donald Trump. Like, I wanted to explain some of this from a cultural perspective, while also not putting too much onto what I argue is a lazy, trope about machismo, because I'm not a big believer in that machismo is a cultural driver for us. And I'll get to that in just a second.
right,
But I was 8 or 7, 8, 9 years old, and my first political memories were, ribbons around oak trees is what we were
Right.
doing as a
Right.
country to um to remember every day. It was kind of like the red ribbons we did after 9/11, but people were putting yellow ribbons around oak trees in cities throughout America to remind us every day that we had 50 United States citizens being held in this Middle Eastern country, that were being paraded every day, American flags being burned, blindfolded with American people. And there's something horrifying about those images. They're terrorizing, which is what the
Right.
goal was to do, was to bring America to its knees. And Reagan does come in with this very strong, masculine, forceful foreign policy agenda, saying we're not putting up with this shit anymore. Like we're not,
Right.
this ain't gonna happen on my watch.
Right.
And the language reminded me, and again, there's so much that is reminiscent of what I'm seeing in today's Democratic Party. Kamala Harris took to the floor of the DNC and said, we will have the most lethal military capacity in human history. Like that is
Right.
stronger language than Reagan used, right? Like,
Right.
and as a woman, I think part of it, she's got she knows she's going to be challenged by Putin. She's going to be challenged by Xi. She's going to be challenged by Iran. And what, a president has to display that sort of, it has to posture that way to defend their country. And that was very appealing. Probably was the 7, 8 year old, kid in me who was,
Right.
watching my country being humiliated every day. And
Right.
I don't want to discount how base and elementary that sentiment was. And the propaganda works. It does. That's why
Sure.
they do it. But
Right.
but but I also there was also the equation as a poor Mexican kid with Republicans being wealthier. And I
Right.
could
Well,
not
you talk
understand.
about that, right? That
Yeah,
your parents,
yeah,
when you first started working for Republican candidates, they were like, "Why? What are you doing? Why
yeah,
are you doing
yeah.
this?"
And my family, I mean, we struggled. I like to say, I wish we were paycheck to paycheck. We weren't. We weren't making
Right.
it, there's a whole litany of stories that we can all talk about as part of many of our experiences. But it never occurred to me that when the parties were explained to me, it's a very common conversation that happens in Latino homes all over the country, which is the Democrats are for the poor people and the Republicans are for the rich people. And I think that's presented by saying we're poor, so stand with the people that are with us. But my immediate reaction was, why the hell would I want to be poor? Like, I don't want
Right.
to be poor. Why would I not
Right.
want to associate and equate with the rich? And that combined with all of these, again, I don't want to diminish the effect of the propaganda, but I will also say the philosophy of self-determination through policies that I believed, and by the way, still believe, lift not just our all boats economically, but the human spirit as individuals
Right.
is necessary for our people. And,
Right.
and as a Californian who has watched the state become overwhelmingly blue and overwhelmingly Latino with representation, I've also watched our poverty rates explode and our affordable housing rates get really, opportunities become horrible. By every social and economic metrics, Latinos are doing worse now than they were 30 years ago when Latino numbers started to explode and our representation started to explode. So,
Right.
like I said, there's truth in both what both parties are saying, and to diminish one side or the other, to me, is just it's intellectually dishonest with yourself. Like,
Right.
if you think
Well,
these
I think
parties, yeah,
it's really interesting to hear this because I think in some ways one of the things that your book does is that I mean you make the mention now of Vice President Harris, adopting this much more sort of muscular foreign policy position. I would argue that Democrats have sort of adopted some of the economic policies of
yeah,
aspirational capitalism, right? That there is a
yeah,
wing of the Democratic Party that wants a greater focus on the working class. But I think if you look at mainline Democratic policies, this is not the Democratic Party of super big government. Right? It's like people are arguing for marginal changes in tax rates, and that's really it. It's almost as if the Republican economic agenda as it existed, say, 30, 40 years ago, it won the day. It sort of
Yeah.
convinced Democrats, and I have Democratic friends who are likely going to hear this, and they're going to send me very strong
Now,
emails and
yeah.
text messages. But it does seem that way from
Well,
this perspective.
it doesn't just seem that way. Let me break it down. And John's not saying this. Mike Madrid's saying this. So send the hate mail
Yeah.
here because he doesn't deserve it. But let me put it this way: if when I was working with George W. Bush's campaign in 2000, if he had heard Kamala Harris's border security platform as a Republican contender in the primary, he would call that un-American and anti-immigrant.
Right.
Okay, let me say that again. Kamala Harris is far to the right of where George W. Bush was in 2000. Okay, well, that's one. Two, we're drilling far more oil than George W. Bush ever imagined we would domestically. Like our
Right.
energy production is off the charts by drilling, even in sensitive areas at this current moment in time. The Biden-Harris administration has expanded NATO more than Reagan ever did, and is just as anti-Russian. So this muscular foreign policy based off of our alliances and deterrence, this is the Republican Party essentially that I joined in the 1980s. That's where the Democratic Party is right now. That's not conjecture. These are literally in the policy platforms of the Democratic Party. So when my Republican colleagues are like, well, how can you possibly be with this socialist communist? I'm like, this stuff is basically the opportunity economy, as she's calling it, which is, by the way, ripped literally out of the pages of Jack Kemp's philosophy, that the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Ronald Reagan. Here's the policy: let's give tax credits and tax cuts to corporations to allow working class people to have ownership in those companies. That's called the ownership society. That's 1980s Reaganism. All of this is Kamala Harris's policy platforms. So when people say, how can you support, communist, fascist, whatever, I'm like, this is everything I'm hearing from today's Democratic Party is literally the same thing I was hearing as an 8, 10, 12, 11-year-old kid from Ronald Reagan's Republican Party.
Right.
And it made sense from a policy perspective for me. And that's why I think it's being resuscitated as the Democrats are struggling with working class voters and trying to get back into working class people. The policy solutions they are consciously choosing to go after these Latinos, which we used to call Reagan Democrats in the 80s, are on these exact same issue sets. So yes, it's not just sounding and rhyming like it. In many cases, it's exactly what the policy proposals are.
Let me ask you, because we've talked about this question of class a lot, and you spend a lot of time in your book talking about this issue. I am curious about what class issues. I mean, you mentioned housing just now, but I am curious, like when you think about, polling, right? We have a ton of polling of Latino communities all over the country. Every time the top issue is the economy, right?
Yeah.
That was true, years ago. We used to, at Hispanic Federation in New York, we used to do polls, and every year, same issue. It was the economy, economy, economy. And but I'm curious what that means today, right? Because I look at the economy right now, and unemployment is down. We've had a major public infrastructure investment program. I take the train in from New Jersey and I see union workers building railroads or at least rail networks for New Jersey Transit to deal with delays and all this stuff. What is it that's missing here in the messaging, you think, um, for the Democrats in particular?
That's a great question. The answer is where 10 or 15 years ago, it used to be jobs and job opportunities. The issue of economy is now about affordability. And when you have an economy where our currency has been devalued by 20% over the last 3 years, when you have an economy which is, correcting and getting better, but when interest rates tripled and shut down basically home building and home construction, one in five Hispanic men work in the residential construction or related industries. Like,
Mm,
that is the whole Latino
yeah.
economy. I mean, without construction and building,
Right.
home building specifically,
Right.
not just bridges and infrastructure, large infrastructure projects, although those matter too. It's literally home building. And both of those happened for the first 3.5 years of the Biden-Harris administration. And so, yeah, S&P is doing great. And I remember these same conversations when Republicans would be saying the same thing. S&P is doing great. The Dow is doing
Right.
great.
Look at your 401k, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And Democrats would be saying, yeah, but working class people are suffering. Now it's the
Right.
exact opposite, right?
Right. It's
Republicans are
interesting.
like
Yeah.
saying working class people are suffering and they're hurting out there. And the Democrats are like, oh, but your 401k is doing great. And the S&P is doing amazing and everyone's making money. And that in a nutshell explains the changing and transforming coalitions is the parties have changed completely. And for
Right.
people our age and younger, older, it's very hard to conceive that the Democratic Party is really no longer the party of the working class. When your
Mm,
argument is that the S&P is doing great and look at all the job growth numbers, and they
yeah.
forget what it's like to have to not be able to put food on the table or pay rent on Friday, or that the job that you're getting, you've got to get another job because the wages that you're getting don't allow you to pay rents that have gone up 25-30%, or you can't put your kid in a soccer league because you just don't have the money to do it because you gotta feed them first. Like that was the family I was raised in. Like I
Right.
get that. I understand that. I think it's made me a better political consultant. But when I hear Democrats talking like that, I'm like, you guys just don't get it, man. You guys are so far removed from the understanding and this emphasis. But they want to deport everybody. They want to, build a wall. They want to separate kids in cages.
Yeah.
I get it. That is true. And I'm not saying Latinos don't care about that. Anybody who says they don't is wrong. But the immediacy of day-to-day life doesn't give them the luxury to think like that.
Yeah. Yeah. You write about this. And I think more and more people are starting to make this argument. And I want to preface this by saying that, the immigration policies, I remember here on campus, at the height of the Trump administration, we had students who were legitimately
Yeah. Yeah.
terrified
Yeah.
of going home, terrified for themselves and terrified for their parents. And that was very real. That wasn't an illusion. Um, but when you look at the community as a whole, um, it's amazing the extent to which, number one, I don't think the immigration issue is at the top of Latino voters' concerns. I'm not sure that it's in the top three, maybe, with the economy and public safety, I think being kind of up there. I think the other thing is that there's this there's a sense that Latinos who are in the United States are inherently pro-immigrant, and it's very difficult to hold up a mirror to the community and discover that, to your point, some tios and primos um, who many of whom are recently arrived in this country,
Yes. Yeah.
are kind of like, you
Some
know
came
what?
undocumented. A
Yeah,
lot of them came
close the door
undocumented.
behind me, and there are too many immigrants, right? And I wonder if you could touch on that a little bit and how it impacts the political calculus for the parties.
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question. I think it's the one that tugs at so many of our heartstrings, and I can't tell you how many hundreds of focus groups I've done. I remember doing focus groups in the Central Valley of California for Antonio Villaraigosa when he was running for governor, former mayor of LA, very progressive politician in his era.
Sure,
I go through our complex relationship. We were very bitter enemies early on, but ultimately
right,
he's one of my dearest friends now. I ran his campaign in 2018, and sitting in those focus groups and listening to voters who had come earlier in their life as undocumented, saying we need to shut down all immigration. Like
right,
it's the and we can extrapolate all sorts of data, but we also have to recognize, first of all, that sentiment, at least in our community, has always been a third of our voters have been like
Mhm.
that. One, two, we are decoupling border security from immigration reform. And this is what you're going to hear a lot about in the coming decade. Because for 40 years, since IRCA in 1986, the Democrats have tried to hold those two together. Immigration reform and border security had to go hand in hand because they believed, rightfully, that the Republicans were never negotiating in good faith. And if they put up a border security policy, the Republicans would take that and not do the immigration pieces, the DACA
Right,
protection, the pathway
right,
to citizenship. And that's all true. But here's what happened, and it really happened earlier this year. As the numbers and the concern, as look, and the border was in crisis for the past 2.5 years. It just was. The numbers
yeah,
were just overwhelming. Something needed to be done, and Biden is kind of stuck because he ran on the most permissive, I would argue, the most permissive, at least in tone, border security or lack thereof position as for a modern day president. And
right. He was also arguing, I think, for the moral imperative
yeah,
of
yeah,
welcoming the stranger, right? I think it is
yeah,
very
and
in line with his
and
sort of religious view. Yeah,
and let me be clear, I campaigned for him. I burned my career down for him because of that.
yeah,
I'm not arguing against the migrant.
right,
I think
right,
you take second seat to nobody on protecting the
right,
refugee and the least among us. Nobody in my career. But what I will also say is I'm also a political professional. And you've got to look at the numbers of where people are at, not where you want them to be. And not just all Americans, but Latinos moved significantly. When Joe Biden signed that executive action on asylum, 69% of Latinos were supporting him compared to
right,
70% of overall Americans. There was no difference. When,
right,
when Greg Abbott was flying the undocumented to Martha's Vineyard and sending undocumented to blue states, 42% of Latinos were supporting that. Last week, the MSNBC Latino poll came out. MSNBC, okay, this is not, some crazy right-wing media outlet, showed that Latinos by a 7-point margin trust Donald Trump on border security more than Kamala Harris. Like at a certain point, you have to pay attention to facts and data and math and evidence and start saying, okay,
right,
I may believe this myself. This is the world that this is my moral worldview, and that's fine. But I also have to understand that they're going to lose this race if they don't make a pivot. And
right,
they're going to lose, and they're going to lose with a historically high level of support for Donald Trump. Okay.
right.
So you've got to listen to the evidence. You have to, and that's why they
I,
made the pivot. And
you
does that
talk
mean that
about the
does that mean Latinos are becoming more anti-immigrant? I
right,
mean, look, maybe, but what I will say is they are becoming more supporters of border security. And I don't think border security makes you anti-immigrant. I don't think border security is
right,
racist. I don't think
right,
Ruben Gallego is a racist. I don't. I
right,
don't think Salud Carvajal, Congressman Carvajal is a racist. I don't think, Tony Cardenas is a racist. I don't think that Luke Correa, these are all people that I've worked with for 30 years
yep,
that have been huge advocates for the undocumented that are now in the border security conference for the House Democrats. These are Latinos who've been fighting this fight for 30 years. They're not racist. They're trying to solve the problem that is their responsibility, and it's a responsibility for a sovereign nation.
right. I wanted to ask you about you said something just now. And I want to tie it a little bit to the world of political consulting. But one of the things that you write in your book is how both political candidates, but especially political consultants, and that sort of world of that small, very white world of political consultants that get hired year after year, they don't do a very good job of listening to Latino voters. They make assumptions about the community that are really to the detriment of their candidates. And I wanted to ask you about sort of the business part here, because I don't think most people, when they think about political campaigns, think about the people, we have this image of the smoke-filled rooms and the party bosses, And, you know, as somebody who worked as a political consultant and at a firm, they weren't necessarily smoke-filled rooms. People were having Chardonnay. You know, it was much more professional. But there does seem, at least from what you wrote in your book, that in both parties, there's not an avenue for having Latinos sit at the table making or helping to make decisions about advertising, about GOTV, about any of the things that are so essential to campaigns being successful. And I wanted to sort of pick your brain a little bit about that because you've been in this for so long, you ran your own firm. Like, tell me a little bit about that.
This is such a really deep, insightful question because I'm gonna jump to one of the other problems that I've seen before I get to tackling that specific question, and that is this. I think in the need to climb the ladder, there are not a lot of Latinos in this business who do this at the highest levels.
Yep,
If you take all of them on both sides and put them in a room, we all know each other. Okay, both sides. Like there's that
right,
few. But one of the problems that I have seen, which has really hurt the Democrats, is in order to climb the ladder, they have had to play to the stereotype of who we are, as opposed to what the data is really saying. And that's where you get these caricatures of like the Latinos con Biden and Viva, Harris campaigns.
yeah,
When we know, and let's go to a Mexican restaurant in Tucson and talk about immigration and immigration and immigration, and
right.
everything needs to be done in Spanish or you're not talking to Latinos.
I
Eight,
love the way that you describe this in your book, so
oh,
sombrero politics.
sombrero politics,
Uh,
man. And
right, right,
it's so self-serving to those consultants because especially in the Democratic Party, white progressives can't say, no, that's not right. Even if the data says it's wrong, they've got to hire you and give you money anyway. And you and your firm and your compadres make a ton of money, but it's not only not working, it's hurting your party. But nobody,
right,
unless you're Latino or Black, can say that's bullshit. Like that's not true. And so there's this tendency to kind of be the marionette and kind of dance in the
mm,
party for the white elites, the white progressives, to be like, oh, you want to do Latino stuff? Yeah, we can do Latino stuff for you. And it's just like so offensive to me. When I'm trying to say, look, I'm a consultant and I'm damn good at what I do, and I can run campaigns broadly. I can do the general consulting part. I'm not just a Latino guy. But there is this need to there's so much money now that there are
right,
people that do the kind of they play the minstrel. And
mm,
I hate to be offensive, but that's what it is. It's like, I'll wear a sombrero for you. We'll go to a Mexican restaurant for you because that's where all Latinos hang out, right? And we all are
right,
watching Univision, and we're all, and it's the data is so overwhelmingly contrary to that. But there's a handful of firms in the Democratic Party that have just been driving this false narrative for a decade, and they've been losing Latino voters while they're doing it because
right,
more and more Latinos are like, the Democratic Party thinks that's who I am. Like that's what they're selling me.
right,
But I also, at the same time, I understand it as part of this, my generation of people who are breaking barriers and getting to the higher levels of running not just campaigns, but corporations and academic departments. Is at what point do I have to stop doing the balance between showing my ethnicity and leaning into that to make white power structures happy, and
mm,
just
yep,
show the actual evidence to say maybe Latinos aren't that different on this issue. If you can't pay the rent
right.
and you're white, you can't pay the rent and you're Black, you can't pay the rent and you're Latino, maybe it's a class issue. Maybe that's what we have the problem with. Maybe,
So
yeah.
let me ask you this because we had a question in the chat from one of our guests asking because I think we've made it pretty clear, right? Democrats are kind of like, you know, they're, I don't want to say they're hemorrhaging Latino support, but you know, we have a nick here, and it continues to bleed slowly. Um, I, I'm wondering what it is that right now you see the Republicans offering uh, Latinos that is so attractive, right? Like what? Because I'm listening to this current iteration of the Republican Party where you've had a lot of the Republicans who you may have worked with in in California, or may have been supportive of George W. Bush. Um, that that group has left. They have left the party. They are abandoning Congress. They don't want to be a part of this anymore. And so I'm curious, when you look at the current iteration of the Republican Party, what is it that they're offering that Latinos are connecting with, one, but also um, what is it that the Republicans actually do do for them or propose to do for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I argue in the book is that this is happening despite Republican efforts, not because of them. I don't think that they're arguing. And let me also say this. I don't for a moment believe that Latinos are becoming more quote unquote conservative. That's not what's happening.
Right.
What is happening is most of this change in our understanding of Latino voting behaviors is coming from the young. It's coming from this emergent group. It's why I push back very strenuously when people use the term a racial realignment. We're not
Mm,
realigning. A realignment presupposes that there's a vote history that people are changing from here to here. That's not what's happening. What's happening is young people are coming online with a very strong populist sentiment. They don't believe either party's bullshit for good
mm,
reason, especially with Latinos. It has never worked out for our community. I would love to have anybody listening come visit California with me for a week. If you think having more Latino representatives and they're all Democrats is some sort of a paradise for Latinos, you are in for a rude awakening. We are one of the worst states in the country by all of these economic and social standards. And I say that only to suggest that Latinos are becoming more populist. They're becoming more anti-party. We are the
mm.
largest group of no party preferences. We are the largest group of the unaffiliated. A lot of the, one of the amazing statistics I point out is not just Donald Trump, who has overperformed and shocked people with Latino voters. The other guy was Bernie Sanders.
Right.
And a lot of them was in the same precincts where Bernie Sanders was winning in the primary. You saw some of the biggest rightward shifts to Donald Trump. And both of their messages are both saying the parties are rigged, right? That's Bernie Sanders, or drain the swamp. They're not just running against the structures of
Yeah.
capitalism or America. They are literally running against their own parties. And at the moment, Donald Trump is the most populist candidate on the national scene right now. And that's why I believe he's getting the most traction. It's not
But
about,
it seems, but it
go
does
ahead.
seem odd, right? And somebody in the chat mentioned this, and um, it does seem odd. I'll concede the point about Latinos not wanting to identify with a particular political party, especially if they're second or third generation. I see this with young people all the time, and I think it's a growing, not necessarily Latino thing. It's a growing American thing, right? People more and more are saying, "Well, I'm an independent, or I pick and choose here. I'm not particularly partisan." But for Latino voters in particular, there is this element. Um, there is a sense of a Latino identity, right? That people feel some kind of connection to their culture. And the Republican Party right now, under President Trump, has made this question of being Latino um, uh, so negative, right? That it's such, I mean, you write in the book about Trump coming down the golden elevator and Latino Mexicans are this and whatever. And it could not be more different than what you described, right? Talking about George W. Bush being in Philadelphia at the Rocky statue, talking about Latinos. It's almost as if I understand the populist argument and the attraction of the populist argument, but it's a populist argument that comes alongside this very sort of ugly and frankly racist rhetoric. And it's almost like I can't square the circle.
Yeah, well, let me try a little bit more, because populism, by the way, historically oftentimes comes with racism.
Sure, of course, yeah,
So Donald Trump has a superpower we don't talk about enough, which is he has this innate ability to immediately polarize us on everything. Like, you can't even watch a damn football game anymore without making it a partisan activity. Okay.
right,
And I talk about this in the book. I have always been, my whole life story is trying to reconcile my conservative beliefs with my community, because to me they make perfect sense. They make perfect sense seamlessly. Donald Trump forced me to make a decision,
hmm
because I could not separate my ideas from, I couldn't conjoin or couple my ideas with my biology anymore. I had to make a choice. Do you believe in what he's saying, or is by the nature of your birth who you are? You can't be either in Donald Trump's world. What is happening as Latinos are becoming more third and fourth generation, more and more are deciding, I'm going to be typically American, and I'm buying into the America First agenda over my
right,
Latinidad. Is that racist? I think he's using racist tactics to get there, but I don't think it's inherently racist. I think it's actually the very, very common American experience to lose your ethnic tie and ethnic anchor by the third generation. In fact,
right,
I don't want to say it's universally common, but it's pretty much universally common in our country.
right. Although I will say that I think the Latino experience, um, in some ways, is an outlier compared to other immigrant groups, largely driven by the history of the relationship between the United States and Latin America, and also by matters of geography, right?
And
And
technology
so,
that allows us to communicate and
sure,
reinforce the
absolutely,
culture.
right? The things that I think Latin American immigrants do today from the Dominican Republic or Mexico or Colombia or wherever it may be are substantively different than Italian and Irish immigrants,
100%.
arriving at the Statue of Liberty or arriving at Ellis Island at the turn of the century. So I think that may I see the assimilationist sort of trend line, but I do think there's an asterisk here for
Yeah,
Latinos
yeah.
that's really curious. Yeah,
I believe that 100,000%. But that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It may argue that it's happening in a unique way, and
right,
that it's slowed. It's slower. The sheer size and the length of the migratory wave. Italians, Jews, Greeks, Poles, they came here in 15, 20-year spurts, and you were never going back across the Atlantic in 1910.
correct,
Here we go
right,
back for the Posadas. You can fly to the
right,
Dominican tomorrow.
right, right,
Okay. And we are on WhatsApp talking to our families wherever every day. And we're
right,
consuming media that is produced in our countries of origins in that language. So yeah, it is a much slower, longer assimilative process. And I would argue, and I say this directly in the book, the melting pot analogy doesn't work anymore, because what is happening is so big. Typical Americans are becoming more Latino than Latinos are becoming more typically American.
mm,
They're melting into our bowl of menudo, right? They're melting into our pot. And
right,
and that is unique. So yeah, you are absolutely right. But that doesn't mean that we are holding on to our ethnicity as a static anchor. Our ethnicity is
right,
fluid, it's evolving, it's changing, it's transforming. This was the fundamental mistake that the Democrats made in the early part of this century, is they're like, oh, Latinos will come here and they will forever be Spanish speaking, recently migrated, and of course that's
yep,
not true.
right,
And that change happened faster because I think as a biracial people, by definition, we're half indigenous, half European. Literally in our DNA, we are constituted to be more flexible in our understandings of the world and of culture. And
right,
so we are kind of the glue that holds together this rapidly diversifying American society. And no, none of the power structures of our institutions have any understanding of how that works, because, especially with all due respect, on the East Coast, like, it's so woefully unprepared. It's like
right,
everything is black and white. The first chapter of my book is moving beyond black and white, because unless you
right, right,
understand that we're talking about something that is not in the black white paradigm, this black white power structure, or lack thereof, is an understandable construct of American history for 250 or 400 years. That is the way America and our institutions have viewed race. This,
Right.
this is completely
This
different.
is completely different. Right,
Yeah.
for
And
sure.
so it's
Let me
challenging.
ask
Yeah.
you,
But
because we're getting towards the end here,
yeah.
and I don't want to miss an opportunity to ask you about your work with the Lincoln Project.
Yeah.
Because I think you've written a really fantastic account of the, I think everybody remembers the ads,
Yeah.
but you talk a lot about how the Lincoln Project sort of upset the way in which political consulting happens. And I have to tell you, as a focus group facilitator for many years,
Yeah.
when I heard you say that focus groups are dead and no one cares about focus groups, I kind of I winced a little bit. But there's one thing in particular that I wanted to ask you about with regard to the Lincoln Project. And it was about this idea of a new Southern strategy, right? I think when we hear the Southern strategy, we think of the post Johnson, right? We're talking about Nixon, and then later, in many ways, I think the man who refined the Southern strategy, Lee Atwater. I'm curious about this, and if you could share with us what your thinking was in
Yeah.
putting this together.
So, and I was one of the very first people that was saying, Biden's going to win in Arizona, and we were investing heavily as a Lincoln Project in Arizona and Georgia, but more Arizona before Biden even won the nomination. We were identifying because Arizona has a unique. It's not unique. It's increasingly a combination, but at the time, it met the criteria of having a high number of white college graduates, white non-college graduates, and then a third of Latinos. And whenever I
Right.
see that dynamic, I'm like, that's gettable. Like that Republican's going to lose that seat. And North Carolina meets that criteria. I wrote a book
Sure.
in North Carolina. I was saying this, right after I left the Lincoln Project. Now everybody's like, "Oh yeah, of course, North Carolina." But it's like, no, no, man. I wrote the book. It was there years ago. This is happening for demographic reasons, not
Right.
because of the increase of the black share of the vote, by the way. It's because there's 300,000 Latino voters in North Carolina in a state that's going to come down to 50,000 votes. That's
Right.
that's great for Harris, right? And Georgia meets that same criteria. All of those are in the Sun Belt, right? And what's been happening, and this is really fascinating, but what's been happening is the economies that create white college educated people in places like Austin, Texas, Maricopa County, Arizona, Gwinnett DeKalb County outside of Atlanta, Georgia,
Sure.
Charlotte, North Carolina. These states are attracting college educated whites, and they already have an existing Democratic base with black voters. And they're also, to fuel the construction of all the influx of white college educated voters, are bringing in Latinos to build the construction of those homes.
Right.
This is in contrast to what's happening in the North, where states like Ohio and Iowa, that used to be battleground states, are moving more towards the right. They're becoming more Republican because these are amongst the least diverse states in the union. New Hampshire is becoming
Right.
more Republican because it's all old white non-college educated people in these communities. So in many ways, I called it the New Southern Strategy because the North is becoming the South and the South is becoming the North. By that,
Mm.
what I mean is the progressive views of culture and race are growing in the South, not the deep South, not Bama and Mississippi, but
Right. Right.
everywhere else, from Arizona to Texas, which is tightening up, to Georgia, which went blue and is on that trajectory to continue to do so. Florida's an outlier because Latinos are different in Florida, right? But the most of the stretch of the South is creating what we call now is the blue wall, which will probably
Yeah.
get Kamala Harris elected. This is the last time that strategy works. And the Democrats are in deep trouble because they're losing the Latino middle class. And
Right.
now the math is like, as the Democrats are becoming more unrelatable to the working class in America, It's manifesting most with white, blue-collar, Rust Belt voters because the math has more of them there. But that's not the case after this election. That's now
Right.
going to be Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, all of these places that are where Latinos are at and hitting big numbers of blue-collar workers
Right.
are going to become, that's the working class that the Democratic Party is going to have trouble.
It's interesting because those are also the states where we have seen an increase in voter ID laws.
Yeah.
Right after Shelby v. Holder, that those states made it infinitely more difficult for people to register to vote, trying to actually punish organizations that are trying to register
LULAC.
new voters.
Yeah.
Yeah, LULAC, Hispanic Federation. There's no question that. I think Republican leadership in those states probably sees the writing on the wall that you're talking about right now. And for reasons that I can't quite sort of understand, other than their fear of, uh, of getting in the bullseye of Donald Trump, they're not going out there and necessarily hustling votes in these communities. It's
No, but that's exactly right. But again, the great irony of the moment is they're getting more Latino votes.
yeah, yeah,
The Republican Party is more diverse now than at any time since Lyndon Johnson signed the '64 Civil Rights Act.
right.
So we've got to, again, and I get it because of the way you and I came of age, it's everything comes back to race. That's not what's happening with younger people of
Yeah,
color. They're not seeing the
yeah,
world that way. They've got much more immediate concerns about the system, the planet burning, this
yeah,
populist
yes,
system. It's just
right,
they don't
exactly, yeah,
see,
right,
like Gen Xers and Boomers. We were like, oh, someday there will be a colorblind society. Now this new generation, these new younger generations are more colorblind, but they're not voting the way that we thought that they would because of
right,
young class.
right.
And
Also, I think the question, and you raised this in your book, and I was very happy to see you cite the work of a CUNY colleague, Richard Alba,
yeah,
talking about this question of people were expecting the majority minority, and you know, he, you showed the polling on that, and that's, once you start talking about majority minority, the white voters in both parties become very uncomfortable.
yeah,
Whereas if you begin to talk about this sort of mix,
interracial,
right?
biracial.
Right,
Yeah,
that or what you refer to as the almost like the brown electorate, they seem to be better
yeah.
with this,
Yeah, and they will be more like, look, and Alba's work is amazing because it does. Latinos have the highest interracial marriage rates with everybody, by the
Right,
way. It's whites with blacks with Asian Pacific Islanders, like everybody. I mean, we can impart our own jokes there or whatever, but
right,
we are a biracial people,
right,
and this was on stark display, the two Americas, when Donald Trump is saying Kamala turned black. Like the whole idea of being biracial
mm,
is just it doesn't hit an old white guy can't comprehend what that even means. For young
right,
people, it's like, well, isn't everybody kind of biracial? Like we all are, right? And we all are becoming
mm,
so. And that I think is the hope for the country. That's what I think the biggest hope for the Latinization of America is. That's why I called the book The Latino Century, because that's going to be the norm in the last 50 years of this century. Is so many of
right,
us are going to have so many racial identities that complexity necessarily becomes, I would argue, a glue that holds us together if we can handle our class problems. If we
right,
talk about our working class problems, I don't want, look, we're human beings. Our racial problems will never go away. We will always find something to hate each other for because it's just the way we're biologically constituted. But what I will say is it will dramatically change and transform into something much healthier, much better, much more resolvable for our communities, for our people,
right,
for our nation, where we start to become a true nation. Because look, especially with the African American experience, Black people have never had a full seat at the American table. Latinos, our history hasn't
right,
either. The Native Americans, all of those. But we're gonna get a hell of a lot closer in my lifetime, let alone the lifetime of your students. And I think that's what's so remarkable about this century. Again, that's why the book is titled that, is Alba's work shows us that the more people interact with biracial people or Latinos, the more comfortable they become. It's the same
Right,
thing that made
right.
marriage
It
equality
becomes much more
possible.
normalized, right?
Yeah. When I
Um,
went to school in DC in the 90s, I was the first Mexican American kid that like 80% of my friends ever met. They never met a Mexican American kid.
right,
And that's crazy for young people to think about now because it's so
right.
commonplace, but that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm old,
Well, I
but
will say on the East Coast, even Mexican Americans in the 1970s and 1980s were not necessarily easy to find in the greater New
I
York
go
metro
look,
area.
man. And
Um,
Mexican food is harder to find.
it was absolutely harder to find. One final question, because I have you here. I don't like asking, you know, political consultants to look into their crystal ball, but I'm going to do it anyway. Tell me where you think the Latino vote lands in November. What's your sense, 30 days out from election day?
I think that let me say I think Kamala Harris is going to win. I think let
Okay,
me say that because, and I think she's going to win in large part because of the overperformance of white college educated women. Uh, I think that Trump is going to pick up another point or two with Latinos,
right,
which
okay,
which will make, by the way, the third election cycle in a row where he has increased his vote share. He
right,
and like I said, I hope he doesn't hit 40 because that then Arizona and Nevada are gone. I don't think he will. I wouldn't be surprised if he did, but I think it's more likely today that Trump does better with Latinos than he did against Biden in 2020. And that was the number I'm
and that
looking
was
at.
already remarkable.
It's shocking, but like I said,
Yeah,
there's so much denial still in the Democratic Party as to
yeah,
why it's happening. And they're just, if they spent more time focusing on listening and learning and looking at the evidence, as opposed to sticking to their failed strategy over the past decade, which is they can't get past it. And I get it. That's why I brought up Latino consultants is a lot of these guys have made a lot of money on this bad narrative based off of bad data, and if they adjust away from it, they lose their identity. They get kind of, exposed for being the minstrel. And
right,
we need good data right now to solve this problem. The stakes are too high. And so
right,
my hope is, look, 35% to me is the number to be looking at. If Trump does better than 35, this continual increase keeps going. If he does less
right.
than 35, the Democrats might be on a trajectory to solve the problem.
Okay. Uh, Before we go, I want to say a quick word of thanks. First of all, on your team, Mariana Mancuso,
Thank you.
who was fantastic in helping us put this whole thing together. And then Mindy Bockstein, Jennifer Lorenzo, and Alexa Barazano on our end here at John Jay, who are at the External Affairs Office, and make these magical events happen. Mike, it was wonderful to have you here. The book is The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy, Simon and Schuster, available at your local bookstores, Amazon, Audible, et cetera, et cetera. When you are in the city, the doors are open here at John Jay. Would love to see you. Thanks for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Looking forward to doing this again. Maybe we'll break bread together, have dinner with some.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That'd be wonderful. Okay, be
Thanks, guys.
well. Thank you, everyone.